Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at sampling. So, as internal auditors do their work, they often need to select a sample of transactions to take a look at. So, to better understand how this process works and what needs to be done and avoided, we have with us Kathleen Crawford, who's going to help us better understand these dynamics. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So, internal auditors generally test transactions, and sampling is a very important part of that. So, can we start by taking a look at the definition of sampling and then some of the key things we need to keep in mind as we do sampling in our work?
Yes. Well, sampling comes in two flavors, but let's first start with a working definition. Sampling is applying an audit procedure to less than 100% of the account balance or class of transactions. So when we have so much to look at, and we want to balance the use of our time and our other resources, we're not going to audit this particular one area to the nth degree. But based on a variety of standards and practices, we've learned over time that we can look at less than 100% of those by apply these audit procedures. There's two flavors, as I said. Statistical sampling is one type, and non-statistical or judgmental is another.
Okay, great. So, a big part of what we're trying to do is find out from the sample what may be happening in the population because we may not have enough resources to take a look at the entire population.
Exactly.
So, this subset hopefully will give us insights as to what's happening there. So, as far as terminology goes, what are some of the key terms that internal auditors should be aware of?
Well, we should pay very close attention to that interplay between the general population and the sample size. So here's a graphic to help us with that. If you notice the diagram on the right-hand side of the graphic shows the relationship between a population of items and the sample itself. So we use different techniques to take out, almost like to drill a core sample, if you will, out of the entire population. And based on the methods that we use, we can draw inferences from the sample, which is a much smaller group of items, to the entire population. So here's those two words that I just used, population and sample. The population is the account balance, is the area, is it could be a balance, like I said. It could be some numbers. It could be items in an inventory. So the population represents everything that's available for us to look at, and the sample is a small subset of that. Then we have the unit, which is one, an item of one.
Mm-hmm.
Sample size are the number of items that are included in the sample. So let's just say hypothetically, through either judgmental or statistical sampling, we decided that we were going to look at 25 items in an account balance over a quarter. The sample size would be 25. The sample unit would be each one of those 25. And the population could be any number, whatever is true for that situation.
Okay. All right. So the confidence level then, as relates to what you just described, is how certain or how confident are we, to just use the term in the definition, how confident are we that this sample represents or reflects what's happening in the population? Is that right?
Yes. And we can only say these things about statistical sampling. So confidence level that auditors typically aim for is 95% or more, so that confidence level is not only a scientific term here, but it's also a more generic term for ourselves. We want to be confident that what we say is true for the sample is also true for the population. And that's really, really important.
Excellent. Yeah, so we want to have that level of confidence that what we're saying is accurate to that degree. And we minimize the extent to which we say, well, with 95% confidence level, that leaves 5%, but 95% is very, very high number. So from that perspective, so yeah, we were very confident that what we see in the sample is what's happening in the population. In,
Yes.
in terms of methodologies, you mentioned statistical and non-statistical and so on. So are those the only two types, or are there other types within those two major flavors, like you said?
There are other types. Very, very commonly used is sampling, or SRS, also known as simple random sampling. This is taking the whole population and picking things at random. So hence the name. Simple random sampling is a very common technique that's used in statistical sampling by auditors. Then there's stratified random sampling. So you'll see that the first three talk about randomness, and that is sort of an important concept. But we can alter the randomness to sometimes make the observations more meaningful. So let's say we're interested in activities of within a department where there are 4 people who have very differing responsibilities, but they all fall under the same umbrella in terms of what they're supposed to do for the organization. We could look at the activity of each one of those and do what's called stratify the entire population. So let's say we're looking at the first quarter of any given year. We can see how things were processed by each of those people, and we could still use the same number, the same sample size, but now stratify it proportionally so that we have some representation from each one of those people. It's still statistical, it's still defensible, and that's a really great way to make sure that we get a good flavor for what's going on in a few different contexts.
And to your point about individuals doing the work that's similar, but maybe the amount of transactions they process is dissimilar. So we could take a look at the population and realize or recognize that maybe the first individual processed 25% of the transaction, the second person 50% of the transactions, and the other 2 people that'll leave what, 10 and 15, right? So 25, 50, 10, and 15% of the transactions. So we break it out by individual and then by volume transacted. And then now we have a stratified arrangement, so we can proportionately put transactions based on their involvement in the population. So that's, again, one of the ways we can look at it.
Yeah, and it's a great thing also to look at in that volume sense is that average dollar value of what they produce, so that we see something representative. So there are lots of different ways that you can look at the area processor system and stratify the population so that you get a more representative sample of activity, and then you can make more meaningful inferences about the entire population.
Or you mentioned using reviewing quarterly transactions, so maybe if they're evenly split, then maybe a third from each month, or differently if that's the case.
Yeah.
Once again, as stratification. But then the interval random is where you want to randomize within each one of those strata, right?
Right.
You want to say, okay, so let's say you have 1,000 transactions and you need 10, so every 100th transaction. So you randomize the starter, I believe that's the way you do it.
Exactly.
Randomize the starter, and then you say, okay, maybe it comes out to 87. So items 87, 187, 287, 387, all the way through.
Exactly.
And then that's how you do that. That's skipping. Okay, great.
Exactly.
What are some other techniques that we use or methodologies?
Well, we also can use judgmental sampling. I talked about this a minute ago, just giving the term. It's non-statistical, and I don't want our viewers to presume that judgmental is a bad word in this context. I know it sometimes has negative connotation in other situations, but judgmental sampling is very, very meaningful in a lot of audit work. It means that we're applying auditor judgment, knowledge of the area processor system to what we decide to look at. But here, because it's judgmental and we're involved in deciding rather than making our computer decide what we're going to look at, it doesn't have any statistical inferences. But I don't want that to dissuade people from using judgmental sampling because it can be very, very meaningful. It just means that when it comes time to reporting out anything about what we noticed in this grouping of transactions or events that we looked at, that we can't say that what's true for that grouping is also true for all similar activities over the period that we're looking at. So it's really
Right.
quite important.
Exactly.
There are other terms related to sampling as well, and the only additional one that we have here is attributes sampling. It's a way of looking for specific events or specific characteristics of the sample. And without getting too deep in the details, I'll just remind our viewers that there are going to be some learning activities around this topic, as there are with the other segments that we have shared with you.
Yes, but as relates to those and judgment and exercising judgment on our part and looking for attributes, you may, for example, look at transactions where perhaps the gender of the individual is important to this transaction. Maybe, let's say, in a hospital setting or a pharmaceutical setting, you're looking at procedures or you're looking at medications or treatments, and you want to see if a procedure that's supposed to be applied only to women is being applied to men or charged to men, and so on. So you may want to look at the particular codes to see if something doesn't look right. If you're looking for transaction happen at a certain time of the day, why would someone access certain facilities after office hours or remotely accessing a particular account and various things like those? So certain attributes that you're looking for to look for anomalies. Why someone who is on vacation with a code that shows that on that side of the employee record show that they were on vacation, why will they be also registering transactions? So the attribute on one side matching it to that transaction on the other, and those dynamics can flag potentially some anomalies that we may want to dig deeper into. So as we're looking at statistical versus non-statistical, so what kind of ways how can we determine what are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach, since both are generally used by internal auditors?
Yes. Well, there are, as you say, are some advantages to each, but there's some also drawbacks to each. So let's start with statistical. From the advantage perspective, we can get away with, and I don't mean that to sound like we're lazy, but it's easier on us to be able to look at a minimum sample size because we've used those scientific statistical methods to draw our sample. And also for our newer viewers, I want you to understand that this is done by a computer. We're not doing a lot of mathematical calculations ourselves to figure this stuff out. There's sampling software that we use, and we plug in the confidence level that we're looking for, the size of the population, and so forth. So from an advantage point of view, we're able to get smaller sample sizes that we can draw those inferences from. So, and as I say, very simple to do with software, and we're using software. So relax there. But I would say that the biggest advantage to statistical sampling is that our recommendations or our observations are defensible because we are using those scientific methods. On the flip side, sometimes it can be more time consuming because we may be using a minimum sample size, but if there are sufficient, depending on the method that we're using, if there are a lot of unexpected errors, then we might have to drill another sample. So it can lead to us looking at more things and therefore more time consuming. It's also a little bit time consuming as newer people get accustomed to the different types of sampling that our organization chooses to use. So you might be accustomed to one and you need to get used to another type. So that also relates to the training costs issue on this column as well. There can sometimes be problems with correlation if we're not careful in how we derive our samples, but if we are careful and we follow the guidance of the software, that should be less of an issue.
Right.
On the non-statistical side, this might sound funny, but one of its biggest advantages is subjectivity. We're using auditor judgment in order to decide what to look for. So from I guess an advice kind of situation, we're able to align with how the area processor system works, and that knowledge is going to lead us to look at certain more likely risky things. So making that choice, a subjective choice, can actually pay some benefits. I'd like to go over to its partner, though, no statistical inferences. So again, reminding our viewers that you cannot make statistical inferences about the entire population the way that you can with statistical when we're using a non-statistical method.
Right. You cannot just extrapolate and say, yes, because my sample showed this, that is definitely what's happening in the population. We want to believe it does, or we have reasons to believe it does, but we can speak with confidence to what we saw in the sample, but not necessarily make that extrapolation.
Yes. And then a couple of other things with regard to judgmental sampling, less costly. So we're using judgment, we're not using software, but a possible counterpoint to that is that we might be auditing more or less than we need to if we're using non-statistical methods. And non-statistical methods I would not recommend for newer auditors. Even experienced auditors entering a new realm, so a different organization, a different industry, I would hold back from applying non-statistical methods until you have a sense of what the organization is all about and what and how it kind of how it works and what is preferred. I would avoid that for new auditors and let the newer auditors do the statistical sampling methods, but the non-statistical we should rely on experienced people to do.
And understanding the population and any kind of nuances that may be within that as well.
Yeah.
So as we understand some of these qualitative aspects and different methodologies we can follow, so as relates to sample size, how big a sample size should we aim for?
Well, we have some advice on that. When Sarbanes-Oxley came out in 2002, it had a section 404, that requires continuous testing of internal controls. And so sample size for these different kinds of controls was a point of some concern. Given the requirements of the regulation, what should auditors do? So here's a table that expresses what auditors should look for in terms of the key control and how it's being relied upon by management. And the first column refers to manual controls versus automated controls. The middle column refers to frequency of transaction, and the last column refers to sample size. So in the first column, notice that we have the slash between manual and automated. That's to help us with the slash that's in the last column. So a manual transaction that happens on an annual basis, if there's only one, we're going to look at it. Same thing with an automated transaction. But as we work our way down the list in the middle column, as the frequency of the transaction goes up, well, the automated transactions don't rise. Well, that's because the expectation is that if a control is automated, we shouldn't have to look at more than one to get a sense of whether or not something works. So we look at that one and opine on whether or not the control works as expected. But if we have a manual control, that's when the sample size will increase. We have to look at more when we are looking at something that happens on a quarterly basis, even more when it happens on a monthly basis, and so on and so forth. And as you can see at the bottom of the table, we have 25 minimum sample size for daily manual transactions and 30 to 40 on things that happen multiple times a day.
Right. So that highlights one of the benefits of automated controls, that that the system is going to do the same thing every time, So we only need to test one transaction of its like or its kind. So that's the test of one. We need to make sure before we do that that we have reliable access controls and reliable change management procedures so we can limit who access the code to make any changes, and whoever goes in there and makes any changes, we know what they did. But that being the case, then we can base our sampling methodology on the assumption that, okay, we can look for a scenario, and one scenario should suffice to tell us that that system is doing what it's supposed to do. It has to do with the human frailty. People
Mm-hmm.
who, because they are fatigued, because they are distracted, because they are poorly trained, or so on, that they may not always perform the control that they're supposed to. So we need to test more transactions when they're manual. So we're looking in terms of the population. If you have quarter, then you have population of 4, but you only need to look at a subset of those. And as the population goes up, look at annual transactions. You have 1 per year, but if you look at monthly, there are 12 for the year. How many do you need to look out of those 12? And the number changes. And then you mentioned that that's the minimum sample
Mm-hmm.
size. If the risk
Minimum,
goes up,
yes.
we may need to go up and
Yes.
increase that number.
Excellent
But
point.
under normal circumstances, that'll be the sample size we're aiming for. So thank you very much. This was very helpful to understand the terminology, looking at some of the methodologies, looking at some of the nuances associated with statistical versus non-statistical, and how we can go about selecting the sample size. All of those are very important elements in understanding how we go about sampling. Thank you very much, Kathleen.
My pleasure, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.